What's left of Dariya tells of the horrors that unfolded here. Every corner scarred by a ruthless regime's fight for survival. This Damascus suburb rose up peacefully, demanding freedom. More than a decade on, a shattered Dariya and its people are finally free. This was for our children, Firaas tells me. It's so they don't have to live under the tyrant's rule. Her story of loss and pain so unfathomable for us, yet so common in this place, that for years endured some of the most brutal tactics of the Assad regime, besieged, starved and bombed into surrender.
Firaas says they came out asking for freedom, and they were met with bullets and tanks. She says, we're not terrorists, and they did this. And imagine, she says, there were women and children living in these homes.
So many men like her husband Mazen detained and disappeared. 2 years later, a released prisoner told her he saw him in jail. They beat him so much his wounded leg was infected. He was in so much pain, she says. There was no medical care in prison, and because of all he was going through, he lost his mind. The prisoner last saw him taken away crying and screaming hysterically. She went from one detention center to the next searching for him until they broke the news to her in the most cruel of ways. They handed her his belongings and told her to register his death. There are no words to describe how I was feeling when I left, she says. I was holding on to the hope he would be released and our family would be reunited. They didn't even give me his body. This is the last photo she has of Mazen and his youngest boy. Ghaith doesn't remember his dad. Noor was 6 and so attached to his father. Every day he would wait by the door for him to come back. When I would hear someone calling Baba, Dad, it was torment for me, Firaas says. What did these children do to be deprived of their father? She has to be strong for her boys, she says. She is all they have. Her father also disappeared into the black holes of Assad's jails. Like her husband, their only crime, she says, was being from Dariya.
She says, I'm just one of thousands and thousands of stories, and that's just in Dariya. And just imagine how many more there are across Syria.
With the end of this dark chapter in their history, a new life, a new Syria emerges from the rubble of their broken lives. Jumana Karachi, CNN, Dariya, Syria.
Farouk Habib is with me. He's with the White Helmets, the group Clarissa just talked about, and joining us now from Idlib, Syria. So Farouk, thank you so much for joining us. We're seeing these images, just emotive and frantic search for more prisoners in Sednaya prison. Your team eventually concluded that there was no one else trapped underground. There was hope, perhaps, fear as well, that people were in some other section of the prison underground. Take me through what you and your team experienced.
Thank you. Well, yesterday was a glorious day for all the Syrian people. But today it was a sad day for thousands of families of missing persons. People had hopes and they continued to live in a denial phase, hoping that they would find their beloved ones under the ground in Sednaya prison. But in fact, although reports confirms that tens of thousands of detainees were sent to this prison, but in fact there were only a few thousands, 3,000 or 4,000 people who were there at the time when the regime collapsed. Most of the other detainees, they were either executed, buried in mass graves, or transferred to other detention centers. It took us almost 2 days because we had to respond to every report, to follow up on every piece of information. And honestly, that was at the expense of searching in other prisons and detention centers. 5 of our teams, who were already overstretched under very difficult logistical challenges on the ground, they were fully occupied at Sednaya prison, digging the ground, searching for everything. And there were no detainees left, no hidden cells there. And we could use this time to search in other areas. Now, currently, our teams are already deployed to other areas because we know that there are tens of secret prisons across Syria, in al-Ba'ath party centers, in military bases, in private prisons held by the Kebtakon groups and Hezbollah. And people are they still have hope, and we have to keep fighting and struggling until the last minute, because every minute counts.
Absolutely. I mean, frankly, we saw some of the images and the disappointment on so many people's faces as they were going through documents and still hoping to see a face of their loved ones. You say something really important, that there's a lot of secret hiding places or secret prisons right now. Have you discovered any locations that you're looking at potential sites to release more people?
Yesterday, we announced a financial reward for any legitimate information on secret prisons, and we have received thousands of reports, actually. And you can imagine it takes a lot of time to process, investigate, and identify these locations. We have reached to many of these locations, but we found no detainees yet. But we continue to investigate and search, and we hope we could get people alive.
As Syrians embark on a new era after ousting longtime dictator Bashar al-Assad, Russia fears the era of its massive military footprint in Syria could be coming to an end. The former commander of Russian forces in Syria and now member of parliament is already warning Russia's leadership not to make concessions. Any gesture of goodwill in the Middle East is perceived as weakness. Weakness is unacceptable, he says. What should be done in this situation, he's asked. Talk from a position of strength, he answers. But how much power does Russia still hold in Syria? Kremlin-controlled TV strategizes over what might come next, with maps showing Russia's bases in Syria. A guest acknowledges Moscow was caught off guard again. Thinking about how it all happened in Syria reminds me about how it all happened in Ukraine in 2014, he says. I want to highlight one universal lesson for world powers. Don't take wishful thinking for reality. When a power is crumbling in days and can't protect itself, this is a verdict. For years, it was the Russian military that kept the Assad regime afloat. Russia's Air Force pounding rebel groups, its Navy firing cruise missiles at ISIS militants in eastern Syria. In return, Assad gave Moscow a 49-year lease on both its main airbase near Latakia and a military port in Tartus, allowing Vladimir Putin to project power throughout the Middle East. The fact that Russia has its military assets in Syria also makes Moscow a key player in the Middle East. But now the Russians acknowledge that that status is in jeopardy. Once a key ally for the Russian leader, Putin now allowed Assad and some of his family members to flee to Moscow, a decision folks in Moscow told us they support. We don't abandon our men, he says. He is our man. It was the right decision. He has nowhere to go. He would have been killed. But even here, Syrians living in Russia telling me they're happy Assad's been ousted. We will be able to live in calm and peace and be able to safely visit our country, he says. We don't have to worry that someone can throw us in prison because they don't like what we said. We're happy that the dictatorship is over. Moscow hopes the end of Assad's rule will not spell the end of its military engagement in the Middle East, while acknowledging it's still too early to predict. And you know, Anderson, the Kremlin was asked today what role, if any, the Russians played in actually getting Assad out of Syria, as of course things were collapsing really quickly around him. The Kremlin spokesman said that leaving Syria was Assad's free will, and the rest, he said, the Kremlin would leave without comment. Anderson?